Good evening. It's Wednesday night. Therefore, at 7 o'clock, it must be the Virginia Beach LiberTEA Podcast. That's correct. The most informative podcast in Virginia Beach that comes to you weekly and talks about topics of interest to you. This podcast is sponsored by the Virginia Beach Tea Party and Tidewater Liberty Partners, and I'm your host, John Moss. I have three guests. We're having as always, we're very innovative on what we cover every week. So we're taking a little bit twist rather than having a single guest talking about their thing. We picked a couple citizens to come here and pose questions that they would like to have me answer as a host. And we have, to my left is Langille. And then to my left is Teresa Langille. Get that right?
Hello.
Yep.
Langille,
excuse me.
Jack and Jill.
Like Jack and Jill. And I have Mr. MIT, that's Bill Duke to my right. So we're going to just try to answer questions that they say that they're getting as they're out there in the community campaigning for the candidates of their choice. So we're going to try to answer some of those questions for a larger audience who they might not knock on their door. And I'm sure their questions are shared by many people out there in the public. There's 176,000 households in Virginia Beach. I don't think anybody's going to be knocking on all those doors. But nonetheless, we're going to start off with Glenn on the far left, which I've introduced everyone already. And Glenn, if you want to ask your question.
Yeah, just to get things started, I think a good foundation is kind of who does what. So, for instance, what is the mayor's responsibility?
Well, the city of Virginia Beach has a council manager form of government. So unlike New York City or Philadelphia or Chicago, we don't have a strong mayor that serves as the chief executive. The council hires a city manager, and the city manager operates the day-to-day city operations. So each individual council member is really a legislator, much like a U.S. senator. They don't have any individual executive power as individuals, except the mayor has one executive power. The mayor can declare a holiday. That's in the city's charter. So while every member of council, like the mayor, has only one vote, that's why people often think that the mayor's really just a ceremonial role. But often people tend to forget, like you have civic leagues or any other group or corporations, the mayor is the presiding officer of the city council. And say, well, what does that exactly mean? Well, that means that the mayor obviously sits at the center of the council meetings. Working with his peers, he sets the agenda for the council meetings. That's true. He also, people don't know that he's in charge of the security personnel inside the council chambers. Not the city manager, not the police chief, but the mayor by the city's charter. He directs the physical, making sure that it maintains a safe and comfortable environment, put it that way. The mayor also is the person that, like in any group, he makes parliamentary rulings. So when there's a question about how something should be handled or whatever, the mayor is the one that issues the ruling for the body. So while that sounds inconsequential, and most of the times it is, but anyone who's watched councils knows there's times when that ruling from the chair makes a big difference on how the issue is handled. The mayor obviously recognizes who has the floor to speak. And that is an important part. His role, or her role, whether it's the informal session or workshop or formal session, is to hopefully facilitate the council coming to a consensus, but when it can't, to get to the majority decision in a, I would call it an effective and efficient manner. And also the mayor in those meetings and also in the public is to try to make sure that the public discussion, this is setting the tone kind of for the city, is to make sure that discussions are staying within the policies and procedures and the physical constraints of the city. So those are the duties that people would see in their civic league. Also, he actually is the official person that approves the minutes after every meeting. Like there's a legal documentation of that, and so his little signature goes on there that they're correct. Now, the other role that the mayor has is ceremonial, and like marketing for the city, that's important, to be that face for the community. Also, as he's about doing more of those ceremonial roles, what is he doing? He's trying to build pride in the city. That's political capital the council can use, but also to make people feel good about their community. Also, he's out there to be the chief spokesman when natural disasters happen, and also when major incidents happen. And unfortunately, we had one of those.
Right.
And also, by the way, he conducts the meetings and carries the issues. He provides the transparency and visibility that instills trust that the council is actually doing the public's business. They're doing the right thing for the right reason. So those are tone things. Now, additionally, there are some other roles.
I wanted to ask a question about that because a lot of people ask me, how come we can't vote on that? Like when there's a huge spending bill, and I'm talking about a lot of money, usually a referendum would be put on. Does he have anything to do with that?
Well, can I come back to that? That just deals with the council as a body, because, like I said, the mayor is not a chief executive. It's
Right.
important that now the council can only provide direction to the city manager. So the council individually, the members, are legislators,
Okay.
but collectively, a majority is the chief executive officer. Because that's why there's a manager. He's not the chief executive. He's really the chief operating officer. The council as a body decides the strategy, the priorities, the values. Any major contract has to be approved by the city council as a body. So the body as a whole is the chief executive officer of the city.
Okay.
The manager is the chief operating officer. So I'll come back to your question,
Okay.
but I want to finish up on the manager's role because there's a few things that are important I didn't cover. That on major regional bodies and commissions, the mayor represents the city, which means he's really representing the body. You know, the mayor certainly is entitled to his own opinion or her opinion and has their own vote, but on these bodies and commissions, he's representing the position of the body, not his position or her position as a council member. And then, like the Hampton Roads District Planning Commission would be an example of one of those regional bodies. And then by state law, the mayor is the voting member of the Hampton Roads Transportation Accountability Commission, which determines the priority of regional road projects and allocates regional money for those projects. And lastly, she is the president of the Atlantic Park Community Development Corporation. So these are a lot of aspects that the
different
normal
things.
person wouldn't see. Mostly what they see the mayor as in that ceremonial role, and as the presiding officer of the city council, which is a very influential role.
One more question, and then as far as the city manager, how does the city manager fit into the different council members and the mayor? How does that kind of, and that will kind of put it all together, I think.
Well, the manager is appointed by a majority of the city council.
Okay.
So he works for council as a body. So that means no individual council member can give direction
Okay.
to the city manager. A good city manager, and Patrick Duhaney is one of those, looks for council to, either by a vote or because everything doesn't require a vote. It can be an informal session and there's a consensus and it's obviously, you can see it. And he's got his marching orders because 6 people, you're no longer the city manager. It's like, you work at the pleasure of the council. So, but the key is, the word is council as a body, not as individual council members.
So council as a body gives the instructions to the city manager,
Correct,
and he carries out their instructions citywide.
correct.
Okay.
And so when people say, who holds the bureaucracy accountable, except for the people that the city council appoints,
Right.
which is the city manager,
Right.
the city attorney, the city clerk,
Okay.
the city assessor, and the city auditor. That is the 5, they all work directly for the council as a body. Now, anyone, obviously, when an individual council member goes to the manager and asks a question or do something, clearly he's going to answer their questions, but but they cannot provide direction,
Right.
like go do this. No, council as a body does
Has
that.
to do that. Okay, thank you.
And now back to your question. You want to repeat that so people can
Well,
remember?
What I have heard a lot is people feel like, you get these big projects, these private, public, anything where there's a large amount of money being spent, and they feel like they should have a vote on it, and yet it never goes to the ballot.
Okay. Wow. This is going to be a little bit of a history lesson, so
Okay.
bear with me.
Uh-huh.
And I only know this because Sidney Kellum
And the
himself.
second part of
Oh.
that is, the second part of that is gonna be, when you talk about the planning commission and this commission, that, the bureaucracy between the people and the city council is so heavy. Does the mayor, can he just dismiss one of those, eliminate some of that so you don't have so much bureaucracy?
As I said before,
Uh-huh.
the mayor only executive authority is to declare a holiday. All actions
darn.
come from council as a body. But coming back to the government that sets up, because there is a strong mayor in the city, in the state of Virginia. The mayor of Richmond doesn't have a council manager form of government. They have a strong mayor form of government. So in that case, but anyway, I'll come back. Just to make a distinction that there is an anomaly in Virginia, that every place doesn't have that, and that's a choice that, but the General Assembly would have to make that happen. But when the city came together, and back in the 63, back in the days of Sidney Kellum and the agriculture community, they put a provision in the city's charter. And that charter says that the city council can only borrow $10 million of new debt every year, plus the amount of debt they retired in the prior year. So that, and you can say, well, why did they do that? Well, as it was told to me by Sidney Kellum at the time, is the county people were concerned that the oceanfront would burden them up with a bunch of debt,
Jeez,
and they wanted to have some control over that. He was pretty visionary, I think.
Prophetic.
But anyway, but the point being, that was the control. So in the early days of the city, we had a number of referendums if they wanted to borrow more money. But over time, as you have those, that increases. Because, for example, if you borrowed $10 million in year one, 1963, and let's just say you paid off $1 million of that debt in 63, in 64, you could borrow what? $11 million. $10 million of new debt plus the $1 million you retired. So over time, that just kind of grows. Well, when your appetite for projects that the public won't support grows,
Right.
you find a way to legally circumvent that charter restriction. And you say, well, how do you do that? Well, you get the development authority to issue the debt, which is a separate state agency. And you can say, well, why would someone sell bonds for an agency that has no money? Good question. Well, that's because the city enters into and all those bonds that are issued by the development authority are subject to annual appropriation, which means they don't count as general obligation debt, which would come under the charter, because then you'd get a vote, right? You get to co-sign the note. So the city signs into an agreement, I won't call it a contract, but an agreement with the development authority that they will annually appropriate the principal and interest payments to pay the debt. So now those bonds obviously have to go out saying they're not guaranteed by the full faith and credit of the city, because the city isn't, and that they're subject to annual appropriation from the city council. So they sell at what? A higher premium, right?
Right.
25, 50 basis points higher than what a general obligation bond. But they can borrow that money without having to come to the public, because it's not general obligation debt.
And that's specifically the Virginia Beach development.
Correct.
So,
Correct.
and with that, also, you said back then you could borrow anything over 10 million, it had to be voted on, or they couldn't borrow it?
No. To have any borrowing more than $10 million of new debt plus the debt you retired. So that could end up being 25, 30, 40. It all depends when in the process, what year and how much you retired. If you wanted to borrow more than that, you'd have to go to a referendum. That is correct. And we had referendums for rec centers and roads and those kind of things in the 80s, and they all got approved. The one in 85 got defeated, but the one in 86 got approved. And so the public got to co-sign, and they knew how much the tax was for the rec centers and how much the tax was for the roads, much like the bond referendum for stormwater. $567.5 million is an example. Those are general obligation bonds backed by the full faith and credit of the city. Now, what does that mean? That means that the bondholders aren't getting paid. They can go to court, and the court could order the city to raise taxes or do other things to make good. Now, the other debt, since it's not backed by the full faith and credit of the city, the recourse of the people who lent the money is to take possession of the facilities. Right? That's what they can do. And since we've actually financed schools with those, what's the likelihood that we're going to let our schools?
Right.
So in reality, we're people who do this, it's really denying the public control. We couldn't have done Atlantic Park without a bond referendum. We couldn't have done the convention center
But-
without a
but
bond
they
referendum.
could have asked the people if they wanted.
Yeah, but they didn't want to ask you, just like they didn't want to ask you about light rail.
Well, I was gonna say, what was the study that was done? How much did that cost, the study just for light rail? Wasn't that?
I know, it was paid with federal money. It was like something like, I think, $6 million.
Yeah, so it was
But
a
it was
lot.
paid not to us, it was
Yeah.
paid to HRT. The city never saw that money, just so you know.
Mm-hmm.
Hampton Roads Transportation Agency Transit got those dollars. But, so you're asking about so what you get a vote on, to get back to the point, is obviously then you didn't get to have a referendum on the borrowing, but the principal and interest payments have to be appropriated in the budget, and the city has to acknowledge that that debt is a debt they're going to have to pay, correct? So that's where, so you don't get to vote on the budget as individual citizens. You just get to vote on the people who get to vote on the budget. That's what we have, a representative government. So you don't get that vote. And they're using the development authority to deny you the
Well, I
vote
think that
on
they're
what you
kind
could
of
vote on if you
stretching-
could.
They're kind of.
But it is
stretching
legal.
What representative means.
Okay,
Yeah.
but it is legal. But if you're asking how that happens, that's how.
Okay. Wow.
Bill, did you have a question you want to ask?
Sure, I'll ask you a question. It's kind of different.
It's allowed.
Have you any strong feelings about short-term rentals and home sharing, both Airbnb sort of things, expanding the short-term rental overlays, anything like that? Are people? I know that you have some attitudes towards this. You've expressed. I'm just wondering, has there been any real problems with any aspect of short-term rentals or home sharing?
I'm going to just stick to the facts, and I'm not going to talk what my personal opinion is, because I want to try to keep these as factual. We went through a long process to get to where we are. So I'm going to explain where we're at today. All the folks that were registered with the Commissioner of Revenue paying their lodging tax before we adopted our short-term rental policy, independent of the fact that it was not legal relative to our residential zoning, which the courts have sustained, with the exception of Sandbridge, which by state law, they all have short-term rental by right. We're grandfathered. The policy that we have adopted, the ordinance that governs it, that any community that wants to be and permit short-term rentals, which means over and above that baseline, has to get 75% of the property owners to sign an affidavit petition saying they want city council to consider, not mean they're going to get it, just because they asked, to consider adopting a short-term rental overlay district for their subdivision, not their house, but a subdivision, a broader application. And then if that gets approved, then the people that live within that parameter value would have then the right to have short-term rentals. That's the current policy.
And they have to get 75%, did you say, of,
The property owners within that subdivision, or how it's defined,
just within the subdivision?
to say they want to be considered. They don't
Yes.
get, just because they petition for it, doesn't mean the petition will be granted, but council isn't going to entertain sending that to the planning commission till that threshold is met.
Gotcha.
And so far, no one has, since that's been adopted, there hasn't been anyone who's met that threshold that I'm aware of.
So you need 75%.
Yes. Now, on top of that, there are regulations, short-term rental regulations that apply to everyone, no matter where those regulations, whether you're entitled by right, whether you're grandfathered or you got a conditional use permit when that was going on in the process, they apply. And I'm not going to say that from memory without something in front of me, because I'll probably leave one out or put one in. That doesn't, but needless to say, regulations should always be looked at on a continuous basis as to whether or not they are being effective. And I know that right now the council commissioned, and there is a committee, Nancy Parker's on that committee, Elaine Fetke's on that commission, Phil Hines is on that commission. There's some others in the short-term rental industry looking at which regulations have proven to be effective and should be continued, and which ones might need to be modification. And I'm just going to use one as an example that's being looked at. We had this in the regulation, a thing where you had to post on your property, you know, the name, the phone number, contact was on this 12 by 12, I think it was, square, so that people, if something was going on there untoward or whatever they'd be, well, it turns out that's nice, the intent was great, but it also is an enabler for people who want to burglarize your home. So I suspect we're going to look at that. But there may be other regulations that time has shown that while you hope that that would achieve what you want, we would not. I know they're also looking at is that whatever mechanism we're doing to find the shadow people who are operating short-term rentals illegally, that our ability, how we're approaching that is not very effective. But I have not heard from the committee members I've spoken with, so this is just an opinion, but that we're seeing big issues about the short-term rental properties, at least the legal ones themselves. But I will leave
Yes,
it.
you are.
I said I'm not aware that we are.
Oh, good.
Now, that may well be true of some of the non-elite, but I don't want to get into what I don't factually know. But that is the state of play. There were a number of court cases that were challenging the legitimacy of our ordinance, the city's value. Our ordinance says of residential zoning that any renting less than 30 days is not permissible. So basically, our residential don't permit weekly, daily, anything less than 30 days. So that has been sustained, but these other things. But we should always be looking to how to improve the regulation and why we can't rely upon third-party verification for things like fire inspections or liability insurance. I mean, you got to be thinking about how can you leverage what's already happening in the private sector and just having the documentation loaded or something digitally versus having to have. Anyway, they're looking at all those things, so I think that's healthy. But I think everyone's basically thinking that we drew the right solution. We didn't take anything away from anyone when we weren't enforcing the ordinance, but we're not letting our long-term rental properties, like has happened in some community, which makes housing even more difficult. And also, more importantly, we're preserving people's expectation when they bought a home in their neighborhood, right? They didn't expect to live in a hotel district. So I think we found the right, and I'm very pleased, and I think that's factually where we're at.
So we actually have problems with HOAs overreaching and things like that. The constitutionality of it, of the short term, this is your property, your home.
Well, when you talk about HOAs, and this is the thing, the city does not enforce HOA rules and regulations, number one.
Okay.
You have a contractual obligation that you've made, because when you bought the property, you volunteered. So if you think there's something there that's they couldn't ask you to do, because you can't have a contract that has a provision that's unconstitutional, even if they make you
Okay.
sign it.
Right.
But it's your responsibility to litigate that, not the city. Likewise, if you live in a community that doesn't have an HOA, or has an HOA and has deed restrictions about what you can do, and someone goes and files a building permit, the city is going to enforce the city's ordinances. The
Okay.
city is not going to enforce the deed restrictions that the HOA has imposed. You have to, the HOAs, or even if you're in a non-HOA and you have deed restrictions and you see something, you have to go to court and pursue that at your own expense. The city is not a party to the enforcement of HOA or deed restrictions on private property.
I think that's where a lot of people don't understand the short term. They think it's my house. I have a right to do what I want with it because it's my property. But there are these restrictions.
Well, that's
that are
because
very
when you
limited.
signed to buy it,
Right.
you signed away property rights.
Yeah. Yes.
And chickens and pigs.
Well, that's-
We got to have our chickens.
Anyway,
Well, I was president of a civic league, and I would tell all our members that, listen, all we can do is just report it to the city, and the city will only enforce their rules.
That's
The-
correct.
The civic league has no power to enforce
That's
them at all.
different than the HOA.
Exactly,
Yeah.
it's two different things.
anyway, but I'm not an HOA expert. I just know from serving on council that in fact, all those provisions are civil issues between property owners and their HOA, who they elect.
Right.
Have another question?
I have a question, of course, is on the aquarium. I was told, ask that today.
Okay.
There's a partnership between the taxpayers of Virginia Beach, the city, and the Virginia Beach Aquarium Foundation that runs the Virginia Beach Marine Science Museum. Virginia Beach owns the land and the building, and the foundation owns the exhibits. Okay. I will note that the aquarium is the third largest exhibit or attraction in Virginia for people to visit. And basically from a channel, Wavy TV article, they said 620,000 people have visited between July 23rd and 24th. So a lot of people come and see it. A lot of
Correct.
classrooms use it. So my question is, who will pay for the upcoming restoration? How is that going to be divided? And since the taxpayer pays for this, we're already paying this huge cost, shouldn't we be able to have a huge discount or maybe not even pay ourselves with this many people coming in?
Now you've asked
I
a
know.
policy question.
Yes.
I'm going to tell you.
It is.
I'm going to tell you what I know to be factual, and no one knows the answer of how they're going to address that because that's what council's discussing.
Yeah,
So
it's
there's,
all up in the air.
but I'm going to tell you what I know to be factual.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually the state is also a partner in the Virginia. That's why the word starts with Virginia because the state was a major contributor in the initial building.
They've
of the-
refused that, though, haven't they?
They haven't refused anything.
That's what I read.
Well, I mean, I'm just saying who's a partner in the facility. Doesn't mean they're going to be a partner in future payment.
Of course not.
But I don't know if they are or are not. I'm just trying to say when people know how it started, the state was a partner, the city was a partner, and at that point, I don't believe that the foundation was a major partner at
No.
the conception. It was really, that's how we got this facility, and it was designed to help us get a destination so that people would like, oh, I'm going to go to Atlanta to see their big, Coca-Cola aquarium. I think that's who the big sponsor of that, and Home Depot, I think, are the
Right.
two big sponsors of that. So they make a trip to see it. And so I think the idea would be, and to some extent that's true, because you can look at the numbers. People, or get people to stay an extra day because, we're going to go do the aquarium and spend the day there. So that's another day of staying. So that was the idea of it. Also that it expanded over time to doing rescue, and there's a lot of research that takes place in the back. So it's more than just the museum. It's also a larger animal husbandry. I guess that's the word I would use. A lot of stuff goes on at that facilities, and there are federal grants and other things that go with that. So I'm just trying to put that in perspective as to it's more than just a museum.
Right.
That people, there's another aspect that goes to that stranding of turtles, turns out people, all the things. So it's a community asset because, like you say, people use it for their kids to go there, the school trips and all those things. That takes place. So now the question is how do we want to manage the future of that?
Right.
And now you can look back and say, well, gosh, as we were building all new stuff, this is, like people buying a big house and then realizing that 15 years from now, that house with the 3 heat pumps and
You need
the
heat pumps.
400 amp thing and 6,000 square feet is when it comes time, they didn't put any money in a sinking fund, and or how they're going to get a big enough loan that they can pay. Well, shoulda, woulda, all we can look back and say is, no, there wasn't any depreciation expense capital account sinking fund set aside like we do with public utilities. That's a lesson learned going forward, right?
Right. When you say, wow, that wasn't considered, shouldn't that be something that council considers when they make an arrangement?
I think they should. I'm just saying
They do.
it didn't.
Okay.
They did, yeah.
We don't do it with the city hall buildings. Government, as a general rule, doesn't build capital sinking funds and
Right.
and set money aside for replacement, because probably people would say, gosh, I can't really afford that. And then you might not build that building, right? Well,
That's correct.
so what you're so those are good, which is what we didn't do with I must want to give you an example.
Doesn't pay much of it either.
Well, the foundation, you wouldn't be looking for the foundation to pay that. Any foundation in
Okay.
most places doesn't pay operating expenses, doesn't pay maintenance. They're there to help do capital expenses. Now, what you should ask the question, or you have asked, is don't accept a capital donation that you can't afford the maintenance
Right.
on.
Yeah, because they own the exhibits, so if you take the exhibits away, you have a
Well,
building.
I know they donate the exhibits. I don't know what I can't speak to the legal ownership. I know people. I don't know. I do know that all the employees are employees of the city. They're not employees of the foundation. So all the salary expense, those people that work there are
Correct.
city employees. They are not foundation employees. Just I want to make sure people realize that. So we're paying the electric bills. But what the foundation does, and I know this is a two-edged sword, it's like colleges, right?
Right.
Someone donates, like it's not named after me, but the Moss Theater at Virginia Tech. It's not named after me. But so I wish it were true, because I'd be much better off. But the point being is, so someone donates that big Capitol building, and Virginia Tech is proud to have it, right? But Virginia Tech's now proud to have the operating expense for that. So now the question for the community, I think, is, and I think this is what the foundation, and who wants to spoil a relationship where you have people in the community who have donate sizable, tens of, in fact, maybe by now over $100 million worth of their own money, private capital, private donations. That's a lot of equity that you have, a lot of goodwill that you have going forward. You really want to preserve that, and I can understand why if they privatize it, they might want their money back.
And I
So-
can see them. They've been talking about it for at least a year or whatever. So instead of putting money into a wave pool or something else, I would have thought they would have considered, because it is advantageous to have that aquarium. That's a great thing.
So now you are really asking the right,
Yes.
a
Right.
great question, is that council, the process that the council uses, I don't want to say which council because it goes back to a lot of councils, is they often look at things as one-of-one decisions, rather than saying, what are all the one-end bills on my
Right.
plate, much like you probably do at home. If you know you need a new roof, you probably don't go out and buy a boat, right? So, or a swimming pool. So if we looked out there, because this thing here is not a surprise, like, we own a marine science field. Oh, this isn't like something that just sneaks up on you.
And it's also a very functional part of the
Okay.
community.
Correct,
Yes.
right? You're right on target. So
Uh-huh.
you say, well, yeah, and then why did we give $22 million of borrowing authority for luxury apartments at Pembroke Square?
Exactly.
Well, these.
I could go on with that.
Okay, so now the question, all you can do is hold the people accountable that made bad decisions, but the decision that's now on our plate, since there's no time machine, I can't go back and undo those obligations. Now we're faced with, we can do one to end. Where does this rack up against $108 million Betty F. Williams or a $288 Princess Anne High School
Right.
million? Where does this rack up in terms of collective bargaining? Where does this rack up in terms of any number of expenditures, road projects or whatever? So, and what, over what period of time does that have to be done? You know, they might say, we'd like to have it all at once. Well, and so my kids like to have their allowance a year in advance, but they're not getting it. So what's the phasing? What's the phasing that you can do with these projects, right? You want to
Right.
know that? So I think the question really is
It's a
what's the
priority.
process that the since we're talking about what? We're going to get the 5-year forecast in November, right? We're going to get the 5-year forecast. The manager's already starting the budget process for next year. So this would be a prime time for what? This council to adopt guidance up front, and let's have this community discussion where all the bills are on the table, all the demands for
Right.
capital, and maybe there's some things that thought they were going to get capital that now aren't going to have capital. I'm sure all of us had emergent issues. Your car gets totaled. Wasn't your fault, but you never get the money that it takes to replace your car. So now you didn't plan on having a car payment, and now you do. And you're these families with living paycheck to paycheck. You're saying,
Right, and I
what's-
don't go charge a trip to Disneyland.
so I think people are grown-ups in our community, but you are correct. This is the community asset.
Right.
As a function, we have to decide as a community how that's going to get solved. And I haven't sensed so far that people want it privatized, because in the end, it's the same capital cost. And they're going to want a return on investment. So at what point does the price point of admission make the facility irrelevant? Because no one can afford to go there. I don't know the right answer, but you are posing the right questions.
Right, because they bring it up, it starts coming out. I'm reading about it, and instead they've gone through with these other projects instead of dealing with
Right.
this.
We got a question from the audience.
Right on
Yeah.
right on this line of questioning from Mrs. Ronna Marsh. The flood bonds are supposedly short $400 million, so council is looking for more revenue funding. Because you're pretty much the architect, Mr. Moss, of the funding, the bond referendum on that. Do you have any knowledge of the latest on this?
I do know that based upon current market conditions and prices of material and labor, that the projects have been recosted because inflation's been greater than what we counted on when we built them with good faith estimates. I've heard that number could be as high as $1 billion, which would be roughly 400 million more.
Last I heard, we didn't have inflation.
I'm just trying to stick to the facts,
Okay,
please.
okay.
I'm just trying to
Fine.
I'm trying to avoid any editorializing,
All
just
right.
telling the public that those prices have grown. Which means then, if you know that is true, then the council first has to, and this should be a public discussion, we should relook at the 21 projects. Because you got to look, it's like you're at the grocery store. You got your grocery cart, it's got $565 worth of groceries, but since they were doing dynamic pricing, now when you get to the cash register, it's $1 billion. You got to take stuff out of your cart. But you got to make sure that you're getting the best value for what you can pay for, and that might make you look at those projects slightly in a different combination. And then the next question you have to ask, since this is something the public voted on, and it was a priority, and it deals with public safety, the safety of people's homes, and is what in the CIP really is more important than these. And so what available money is available in that. And then you can say, well, put that in the pot. And then you're going to say so these projects that are in the out years, let's not go borrow money and raise taxes before we actually can put the projects online and start them, because that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But you got to have the same discussion we had with the public, showing them all the breakdown, all the assumptions. And then when you do that CIP, you figure, okay, we found another $100 million out of the current CIP that now we're short $300 million, but it occurs in the last 4 years. It's out here outside the CIP. We're going to carry that. We're going to keep looking every year as revenues, and if revenues come in, much like the governor, if revenues grow faster than that, rather than thinking of new expenses, let's use cash and not borrow money and reduce and pay for some of that stuff with cash and keep looking for grants. But the last thing is say, well, gosh, now we have to raise higher taxes. Well, let's make sure if you're raising higher taxes, and that might be a necessity, make sure your budget is built on the revenue neutral rate for the year in which you're doing that, not on the nominal rate that you're carrying over from the prior year, which is no longer legally the rate. So it takes a lot of
For
a
my-
lot of oversight and critical thinking that went into the original referendum would need to go into the reexamination before people. Because if you go out and say, we got to have billions and billions of more dollars, guess what? The public doesn't have billions and billions of more dollars, so that cannot be the answer.
I have a question on that with,
There's another question from the audience? I
I
want
got
to.
two.
Okay, let's finish those up if
Okay.
we could.
The first one's from Wendy Crutchfield. Without the stormwater resolution, we are destined to run short forever.
Well, what she's referring to, when council adopted, in advance of the referendum, because clearly asking the public to borrow $567.5 million is the big ask. It's the biggest referendum any locality had ever posted in Virginia, and certainly the largest ever for stormwater and the largest in Virginia Beach's history. And its passage was no way by assured. And so to ensure that its passage, I crafted a resolution unanimously adopted by the city council in November of 21, I believe it was. And it said the council will do the following things. We did all of them but one. One of them was 75 words that would then go into the comprehensive land use plan, that basically would tell the staff that they would have to recommend denial to any project that would have an adverse impact on the assumptions and the water standards and the performance of our stormwater management projects, right?
wow.
So that was important. Now remember, the comprehensive plan is only a guide, so it wouldn't be controlling on the planning commission or the council, but the direction was that the planning staff would have to recommend denial, and that's direction we could provide. Well, we had 2 votes while I was on council to pass it, and it failed. And then when the new council came on board in 23, it came up again and also failed on a 6-5 vote, because clearly there are special interests in the community that really, so what she's referring to. Until we have strict enforcement and have these planning department make these recommendations. But I will say that the standards so far, at least I can't speak to all the enforcement of them, but the standards themselves that were adopted per the resolution are still in place. So, but she's right. There's not that we have the staff often recommending projects that do not reflect the intent of that wording.
So if I understand it correctly, does that mean that the Amazon building and that anything that's built that's directly affecting the environment that causes flooding, that shouldn't be done?
No,
No?
what the stormwater management, I know more about this probably than
Yeah.
anybody probably does, has basically set a standard for a 100-year flood event.
Okay.
So many inches, and I wish my memory was perfect. It's not, so many inches would fall in a 24-hour period, and within that 24-hour period of that rainfall, so much that rainfall would fall in a 2-hour period. It's like a surge rainburst
Right.
event. And so the infrastructure of the stormwater management system, think of it as interstate highway, is designed to handle that water coming off a property for a 100-year storm event. But it also means if you're doing new development, if you're less than 10 acres, I believe it was, you have to capture a 10-year storm event of water, meaning that only the water that would come down in a 20-year rainfall or greater would actually flow off your property. And if you had maybe it was, I don't know, hold me on this, but anyway, there's different levels based on the size of your property, how much of the addition, if you have impervious surface, how much of so if you're building a new development, you would have to build these in ponds, right? because that's going to hold that amount of water.
Right.
The amount over that 20-year amount would flow out of your place. That's when you see those little things sitting up high and the water can go down and then flow out, overflow. That overflow is designed to be absorbed by the highway system,
Right.
the big system. So that's how that works.
Okay.
We've got some more comments that I feel are very, very cogent here. From an RM, it will be, and this is political because this is what we're all about, who's voting for what. It will be difficult to get Rosemary Wilson, Councilwoman Wilson, the vice mayor, not to reconcile the budget and give away to the 5 district and her favorite charities and organization. She goes on to say, cut the $60 million Rudy Loop glorification that Rosemary Wilson has pushed. And lastly, Mayor Dyer has delayed the 75 words vote to recommend stormwater denial, and the last one was get revenue from the resort tip fund to help the aquarium. And your
Well-
comments on that?
Well, certainly the tip fund is a trustee account, and that gets back, if I can just digress from what the city has, like 3 categories of money. It's got enterprise funds, water and sewer, trash, and stormwater. Those are 3 enterprise accounts, meaning they issue revenue bonds and they are like, hey, this money stays in here, and it's not fiduciary responsible to move money out of those accounts to someplace else. Then we have the general fund, and within the general fund we have trustee accounts, which are not they're stovepipe, but they're not legal stovepipes. So the tourist investment program, since you are correct, it's a tourism event, the tip fund could be a logical source and certainly a higher priority than a $60 million park at Rudy Loop that no one really wants. They don't want hardscape. They want open space, passive space, not that. That's a source. And so it could be a source of revenue. As to the reconciliation process, which I think is a larger point, this is another process that the council has, that this is after the public's had their speak at the last public hearing. The council has these non-public discussions, one-on-one with the vice mayor, trying to find where 6 votes are, and to get it approved, or sometimes they got a lot of debt, they got to have 8 votes, and that's where you get all these add-ons at the end, and never is there tax breaks in any of that. But what is true is when Jessica Abbott was on city council, that's Jim Wood was the vice mayor, and Mayor Dyer brought forth a reconciliation budget. Cutting out, sorry about that. Brought forth a budget reconciliation budget that didn't have 6 votes. So the council as a body, remember I said the body adopts stuff? The fact that, I'm sure Mayor Dyer wasn't happy with that, but we came back with a different budget than the one they came up with. And actually, I ended up giving the school $7 million more for maintenance, in fact. But I do believe that we would probably be better in terms of a process that if all those amendments were brought forward like they are in Congress and were voted on in public, and that people could see what was proposed, and it wouldn't be this meet 2 by 2 and no one knows what it is but a week before it's adopted and then it's too late to change. But that's because the inertia is towards what? Parochial pork barrel spending at the end. But the characterization is correct in terms of how that process does not work in favor of rigorous scrubbing of requirements.
I have another one from
And I'll get back to you.
a Mrs. Martha Smith Thoreau. There are 5 people running for mayor. Though it's supposed to be nonpartisan, we all know the candidates are affiliated with parties. 4 of the 5 are Republicans, and some are being asked by party big shots to get out of the race and get behind the chosen one, Bobby Dyer. What say you on the subject of splitting the vote by running? And Mrs. Marsh, a follow-up to hers, sunset the 33-year-old tip fund. We cannot afford it.
Well,
Whichever you
I was
say
making
first.
sure this show stays not election. I've been trying to be apolitical as a host. But I can say this, that the budget that was adopted over the last 3 cycles where the city had surpluses in each and every year, plus had growth in revenues, did not mirror what Governor Youngkin did, which was to give half of the well, not quite half, but a major portion of the surplus back in terms of tax rebates. He doubled the standard deduction for income tax. So those Virginians who pay income tax, and all Virginians don't, got a rebate, and he eliminated the state sales tax on food. None of that mitigation of 40 years record high inflation for families, no mitigation was provided in the last 3 budgets adopted by City Council.
Bingo.
I will be happy to address that other question in a different forum. But as to the sunsetting of the TIF, once again, we have to go back and look and see what all the obligations are of the TIF that deal with revenue bonds, where those revenues might have been, if the revenue bonds were issued, I'm not sure they were, but for any bonds that were issued, especially PPPs, the Development Authority, we would need to make sure that if you were going to phase that out, you would need to make sure that all the long-term financial obligations for which those revenues were set aside to pay were taken care of. And then you got to look at other fixed costs. If those fixed costs can't be made go away, then you need to put that into the general fund. I think what she's really kind of after is how do you cap that, and then all the revenue over time goes back into the general fund to meet higher needs. So do we need to look at that TIP fund? Absolutely. But I would have to say, as much as you might like to say, ooh, there's a big, you got to go look at the underlying details to know what's really recoverable. But future growth revenue definitely is something that should be on the table to be examined for priorities.
We have another one before Teresa, Mr. Moss.
Okay.
The silos at Southern Pines will use BMPs that are degrading at the Virginia National Golf Course. Could you draw a correlation between those 2 facilities and what's going on there? Which is, I know, it's a mouthful.
Well,
Okay.
I just had this discussion with someone on the phone this
Did you?
afternoon.
Yeah.
At the time that silo at Southern Pines was being discussed, there was mention, and I can't say it was mentioned as a commitment, but it was mentioned that they were looking at underground BMP bladder, much as like what they had to do at the Olden Nation School for the Gifted on Ferry Plantation Road. Very expensive. But ultimately, stormwater management solutions aren't specifically approved at the council vote. They just have to meet the standard, and that's all done at site plan review by the planning department to make sure those stormwater standards are followed. Well, as it turns out, and I learned this by looking out to the city auditor, came and spoke at a breakfast. The Tidewater Liberty Partners breakfast gave a big presentation on the Virginia National Golf Course. Their total problem is $10 million. Their immediate problem is $1.4 million, which they took out of the corporate landing cash account CIP without any idea of how that's going to be replaced, because obviously they put that in there
Are
for
you
a
talking about
purpose.
the one on?
Yep, Pennybrook Boulevard is corporate landing,
Okay.
office park.
Yeah.
And so then, but the overall bill for of the 10 million to do the ponds was $5 million. And so and then he mentioned that the shopping center, the existing apartment, and now silo drain into the BMPs of the golf course. Now, the golf course is owned by the city, but there's a 40-year lease with the Virginia Beach Development Authority to operate and maintain. And there's a specific clause in that lease, which the city auditor showed up on the screen, that the Virginia Beach Development Authority is exclusively responsible for the maintenance to include the ponds, and there will be no taxpayer city funds. None. So I asked the question at that breakfast, and Glenn, you were there, remember, is, well, did the Development Authority, since they are totally liable for the maintenance of the ponds, did they give permission for the developers to use that as their BMP? He didn't know the answer. I still don't know the answer. I said, did they get a payment? Because obviously somebody avoided a cost.
Right.
So did they get paid? Because now did what they do, what is that additional runoff the cause? Because remember, the golf course has fertilizer and whatnot, but it wouldn't have runoff, wouldn't include brake lining, oil, gas, wouldn't include all those contaminants, right? So I don't know the answer to your specific thing, but I think there are questions about who approved them doing that. Would have to be the planning department. But when I asked a development authority member, who I will not name, if he had any knowledge that, he said, well, that happened. He said, I have no knowledge that anything was approved or that we got any money. But this is the question that council members should be asking. Not us as citizens, but they should be telling us the answer. But I did recommend that they should have a 3-member council commission, which the city charter allows for, to do an investigation and get people to testify under oath, which the charter allows, to get to the root cause of who did what when, and how do we not have this happen again? Because the development authority wasn't doing their job under the contract either. Anyway,
And
I'm going to let her go to her question.
well, I think that on what you were just talking about, about asking questions, you assume you're going to be told, but some people omit information if you don't ask. So people need to start asking. So on the wave,
teenagers.
I'm going back to the wave pool because we brought that up.
Okay.
And from my understanding, I don't know who I was talking to, but that there was actually no business plan. Speaking of incompetence, was there a business plan for that? And I've heard, and people have asked me that, did they find arsenic in the water? Was there a soil sample done before any of this happened? We just want to know, because they're going forward with it, obviously.
Well, you've asked a lot.
Yeah.
I'm going to tell you what I factually know to be true.
That's all I want is facts.
Is when, and first of all, you got to think Atlantic Park as a concept. When it was started in 2017, the term sheet was
remember.
approved in 2018. It just goes on and on. But the first question is, did the city council have performed a business plan that would tell them the total end-to-end cost and tell them what the return on investment was and when they would expect to see it and how much it would be? I'm going to give you the answer that came from the city auditor, not John Moss, is no, there is no such business plan.
Wow.
So now you asked a different question. So does the wave pool have a business plan? That would be not a public document because the wave pool is a private operation.
I thought it was a private public.
No,
Yeah.
the Atlantic Park is
Okay.
a public-private
But the
partnership.
wave pool
But
itself.
the components within it, gotta remember, it's a
Well,
cost.
that's shady.
Well,
I'm sorry.
the place is it's a condominium. This might sound strange
Right.
because you have the wave park, the retail, the apartments, the music hall, the open space, that city property. So you have Venture Wave LLC. You have the development authority who owns the land. You got the city with the parking garages and the music hall. But all these things together constitute the Atlantic Park thing for cost and revenue and all that thing. And that boundary, that almost 13 acres, is governed by the Atlantic Park Community Development Authority, which I mentioned. And the
who's the
members of
chair
that
of that?
authority are the council members in a different capacity by state law, and the mayor is the president.
That's what I thought.
So now when you asked about, so the wave park is its own operation within that, issued its own debt within that. That debt was issued by the Virginia Small Business Fund something. It's got a name, but it's by the state organization, not the VBDA didn't issue those bonds, and not the Virginia Beach didn't issue those bonds. They were issued by this. And on the cover page, it says that no locality, blah, 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 has any liability to pay this debt. Its debt can only come from the revenues of this facility. Now, it's a 5013C, and there's going to be, that actually has that, but that would be a whole nother couple
Right,
hours of
yes.
discussion. So I
Good-
won't go there.
good show
But
to
needless to
have.
say, the development authority, since it owns the land, bears all the responsibility for the cleanup of the soil financially.
Okay.
Does the bottom line mean that the city is gonna be on the hook for all the money that
The
the
taxpayer, yes.
taxpayers are gonna pay for when it's all said and done?
I'm going to give you an example because I don't want to say what will happen. I can only tell you what historically has happened. How's that?
Good.
This goes back, this is, my brain just got a lot of history here. When the 31st Street property you see today with that hotel and that park was owned by the Virginia Beach Development Authority, you're going to hear that a lot. They couldn't make good on the note and
Okay.
they were going to go under.
Okay,
And so they were going to go bankrupt on that. That's what's going to happen. So, the city's got to bail them out. The city's got to bail them out. And I'm saying, hey, let the banks take the property. We aren't legally on the hook for that. None of this memorandum existed then. But what did the bond council tell us? Well, if you don't bail them out, even though it's a separate entity, it's going to reflect on your bond rating. So in reality, I don't know what the market will do. I do know those bonds were rated industrial junk with high risk. They went for one tranche was for 60 million, was over 9%. The other tranche for 60 million went for 10%, and they're not callable, meaning refinanceable until 2033, and it's high risk. But what will happen? But can I say there's no risk that it would impact our bond rating? No, I cannot say that.
John, I have two more here, and Dr. Duke has.
Okay, we'll turn to him next after we do these two.
Okay. This right here is one of them that referred to, we could have a new president that wants 25% unrealized gain on homes. So how do we stop the rampant assessment increases that could cause federal taxes, as shown here as the 25% proposed?
Well, first of all, I think that has no chance in Hades of happening. So I'm not going to even give that the time of day to discuss it because it doesn't merit anything. But what I want to bring to play is the underlying question. You may recall when when the assessments came in for cars, right? And we had this unusual market, used cars just spiked up in value tremendously. I had proposed as early as November earlier that year that we should reduce the rate because clearly we have atypical market conditions and this is just ridiculous. Well, I didn't get a lot of traction until my good friend at the time, and still a good friend, the city, it's always nice when the commissioner of revenue is elected, he's interested in how he can help people out, right? So what did he do? He used a provision that's in the state code to say we have atypical conditions. And what did he do? He reduced the assessment by 25% on vehicles. Didn't change the rate because he couldn't do that. Council's low, no one likes ever to lower the rate, right? Except for me. But so he reduced the assessment. But the logic, now that logic comes from someone who's elected. You should never expect that logic to come from a city real estate assessor who's appointed because they're basically taking money away from the hand that feeds them. But if you take that logic, we have atypical, unprecedented market inventory drew by a lot of events, not unlike what happened with used cars. So why aren't we looking at saying, shouldn't we, look at the assessment might be right, but the assessment doesn't reflect normal market conditions. So, because we all know sales are based and new sales on the margin. So if you only have one house in your neighborhood that sells, and normally in a year they would have, 5 houses, and there's a tight market, well, then that price goes for some big number. Well, but in reality, if the normal number of homes for sale were on the market, you wouldn't see that same level of sales value. So we ought to be looking at that. And there's smart people who know how to control and look at that. And then we what? Discounting the assessment, and we might still even lower the rate lower, but we should use that same logic that we used with cars. The Commissioner of Revenue didn't get in any big trouble for doing that. And no one complained about paying less. But that isn't what you get unless it's pulled from the top. Because the Commissioner of Revenue is not going to volunteer to give up revenue. And I understand why they wouldn't do it. It's unexpected. So I think they're on a good point there. But we need to be looking at the fact that we've had over 3 years, almost a 29% average increase in the assessment of homes, and people didn't get a 29% increase in pay on top of insurance increases.
Okay. We've got one closeout, and then Dr. Duke. Developers on the board of the Virginia Beach Development Authority, and many other boards and commissions conflict of interest, such as the developer Taylor Franklin is vice chair of the VBDA and is building apartment buildings out there by the golf course. Coincidence?
Well, the conflict of interest law for the state doesn't preclude people's membership on a body. It just precludes on what they can vote on. And what that law states that if someone who's coming before you, an entity or an individual from whom which you receive $5,000 in any kind of compensation in a single year of which they're there before you, then you are required by state law to abstain. Now, if you're asking is, do we have the right diversity on these boards? Absolutely not. But go to vpap.org and you can look at explains who sits there and why.
Okay.
Well, since I'm at the end, I'm going to ask something a little bit more lighthearted.
Closer, Bill.
Well, that'll be appreciated.
I hope so. I hope so. We have the aquarium has tanks that are in need of repair, and we are coming up with this wave pool. I don't know if anyone here knows whether the wave pool is going to be filled with salt water. But if it is, we could put the porpoises and the groupers
Lord.
in the wave pool, and then we can have a chance to repair those tanks. What do you think?
Well, given the various disease and viruses and stuff that people
Right,
have, I
exactly.
suspect that
Exactly.
maintain the animals, that might not be the best idea. But
807.
right, well, we went a little bit over this evening, but I think we're going to do this again.
Yeah,
Because I
the
think
bicycle pass were another question
All
I
right,
had.
we might repeat,
For
if we
them.
can't get a candidate, can't come on next week, we will repeat this format because I do think this is getting people to answer the questions that they would like to have asked that often don't get addressed. And so this has been I appreciate all the callers who I shouldn't say callers, but the comment makers there.
Talk about our meeting next week
Yep, and there is a meeting next week.
on the 12th. The Virginia Beach Tea Party.
Party.
We're going to be having a school board forum. So bring your questions on a card or email me or Diana, or a lot of people, if you don't have my number, just hit me up on Facebook Messenger.
That's on Thursday night. That's at the Masonic Lodge on
That's
Princess
correct.
Anne Road, so you know the location.
2849.
Yep,
Princess
very
Anne
nice
Road.
facility. You'll
Starts
really enjoy
at
it.
7.
Yep, starts at 7.
And next month we'll be having the city council.
All right, thank you very much. See you next week. Same bat station, same bat channel. Good night.